I don't know what I did. I think I broke my camera. What is up, guys? So today we are back and looking at another full-blown typing. Today we're actually going to be going over our last typing, which is actually the fire type. And this video is actually a slight struggle because the fire types are kind of all over the place. But we'll get into that. So taking a look into our fire types, I did break them down into 3 categories, just like everything else. So bulk, stat product, and viability. Now, ignore this. I told my fiance I'd leave it up, so I'm not lying. So in terms of bulk, we actually have Torkoal being the bulkiest fire type in the cup, which is kind of interesting. We've already done a deep dive on Torkoal, and we know that his moves are kind of what holds him back just a little bit, but being a big bulky Pokemon is always really great. Next we have Alolan Marowak, which we've already done a deep dive on as well, and Alolan Marowak has a ton going for it. I'm actually considering Alolan Marowak being almost like a Pokemon that you might even need to bring a counter for if you don't bring one yourself, because I feel like a lot of people are going to be going after one, and he's pretty meta. Next we have Magcargo, which Magcargo's not like been looked at too much. He does have an interesting set, and when we get over here to our viability, I will actually talk a little bit more about him. Next we have Ninetales. Okay, and next we have Castform Sunny, which I do plan to do a deep dive on it very, very soon. Now in terms of stat product, the list looks very similar, except we end up dropping Sunny Castform for our Ho-Oh here. And it's kind of basically the same thing, except Magcargo and Ninetales end up switching spots there, and Ho-Oh joins the ranks as one of the top 5 stat product Pokemon in the Kingdom Cup. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. So the viability, we have Alolan Marowak. I do think that's probably our most viable fire type. And the reason is basically because Alolan Marowak has really good matchups against a lot of the meta. It takes out Lucario in a lot of situations, and it's just really, really good. Blaziken, I do think, is our second most viable fire type, and that's basically because he has really favorable matchups against most of the kings. Lapras, of course, does give him a lot of trouble, but against both Bastiodon and against Lucario, he does really well. Typhlosion here, I do think Typhlosion just inches out tiny bit better than Charizard here as the more viable Pokemon, and it's only because Typhlosion's ghost type moves will probably end up doing a little bit better than Charizard's flying type moves, and we'll kind of get to that in a second. And I do think Magcargo, interestingly enough, we've never talked about Magcargo before this, but I do consider him an extremely viable Pokemon after doing a little bit of digging on him. Now, why do I rank these viable Pokemon in this way? Well, a lot of it has to do with their matchups. And if you remember, back in the Steel video, back in the Dragon video, and pretty much all of these type deep dives, we've been basically trying to figure out why these Pokemon are so viable and what makes them viable. Well, here again, I think we have a similar situation as to a previous typing, where it's these sub-typed moves that end up really, really making these Pokemon shine. So Alolan Marowak has tons of energy gain with Hex, and then it has access to Shadow Ball. Blaziken having access to fighting type moves is amazing. Typhlosion having access to Shadow Claw. Charizard having access to flying type moves, and Magcargo having access to rock type moves. I think that's what makes these 5 Pokemon unique and more viable than a lot of the other fire types. So let's actually take a little bit of a look into each one of these viable Pokemon here. So Alolan Marowak actually ends up winning a ton of the neutral matchups in this meta. Having access to ghost type moves is a really, really good thing because you end up having a ton of neutral damage, and you also have Bone Club, which can be hit for super effective on certain things, so it ends up making him a really interesting package. The problem is that because of his ghost and fire typing, he does get countered pretty hard by everything that can counter fire. He doesn't really have any unique resistances that take away his fire weaknesses, so he can end up being really, really hard type countered here. So in terms of what we actually do as far as matchups here, so we actually end up winning against Blaziken, which is a big one, Monferno, Magmortar, Magmar, and Probopass. Those are the top 5 wins in Alolan Marowak's arsenal. Now, there's a common theme amongst a bunch of those. Either they're using Fire-type moves, or they're using Fighting-type moves, which we do have a pretty good resistance towards. Probopass is the weird one because we can basically just push out neutral damage until we get to Bone Club, and then we can kind of just, hit for some really good damage. Now, as far as what we lose against, so these are the top 5 counters for Alolan Marowak, which there's some interesting ones here. Salamence is very interesting. Alolan Marowak has a lot of trouble beating Salamence for some reason. Salamence having access to Bite really does put a hurting on Alolan Marowak, but I don't foresee that being a big issue in this cup. Next, we do have Dragonite. Not too big in the cup. Dragonair though, Flygon, and Magcargo. So you're actually going to see Magcargo pop up a lot in this list, and it's interesting because I feel like Magcargo is going to kind of be like the Flygon and sort of similar to the Piloswine pick that we talked about in the Ice video, and it's just because he does really have a unique set of moves that kind of helps him out in a lot of the fire matchups and a lot in the other matchups. But let's talk about that in a second. Next we have Blaziken. So Blaziken really shines because it has access to Counter. Now we know Counter is such a very good move already, and having access to that as a fire type Pokemon really does boost a lot of your usability in this cup. The problem is that Blaziken kinda just has Counter. Yes, don't get me wrong, his charge moves are just fine. Stone Edge is great to have, but I mean, in a lot of the matchups that matter about Blaziken, Counter's really what matters. His other moves, his charge moves, just, they're kind of there. I mean, you really, if it was me personally, I would be using Counter to farm energy off of the matchups that I can use it in, and then save up those charge moves for a more important, devastating hit on another Pokemon. Because Counter is going to be so good, you don't have to waste any energy on the Pokemon that are already going to die to Counter. See what I mean? So now let's go over some wins and losses for Blaziken here. So we actually end up winning against some pretty interesting ones here. Melmetal, Steelix, Lucario, Dewgong, and Probopass. I was really surprised that Dewgong was in this list. But basically you can kind of see all of those have a fighting weakness. It's Counter that really makes him shine. All of those Pokemon are really going to have a hard time getting over Blaziken's Counter. Now, what actually counters against Blaziken? Well, Alolan Marowak is really good, Ho-Oh having access to flying-type moves, Altaria resisting the fighting, and also being able to dish out some flying-type moves. Charizard becomes really good, and Bronzong is an amazing player up against Blaziken here. So you can kind of see Blaziken has a really nice niche little use case, but he can also be hardcore countered by even some of the other Pokemon we're going to talk about. Next, we actually have Typhlosion. So, Typhlosion's biggest benefit is having access to Shadow Claw and then Blast Burn really sets him up to just be a powerhouse whenever it comes to fire-type damage. He is, in my opinion, I think that Typhlosion is probably the best at outputting fire-type damage alone. So the bad part about that is that Typhlosion only having fire typing kind of falls into Alolan Marowak territory where it can be type countered pretty hard. But as far as what we win and lose against, we actually end up winning against Steelix, Dewgong, Alolan Marowak, Skarmory, and Moltres. So Steelix, of course, we're just going to be able to output a ton of fire damage. Dewgong, we're going to be able to output a bunch of fire damage. Alolan Marowak, we're actually able to output ghost damage and then fire damage. So kind of sets it up to be a really cool matchup. Skarmory makes a lot of sense, and Moltres being on that list is just crazy, but hey. Now, as far as what we lose against, this is kind of where you can see his falter here. So Walrein, Probopass, Empoleon, Magcargo, and Celio all end up beating Typhlosion. So basically, you're either going to get hit with water or ground type moves, and you're going to kind of fall to that. So it kind of sucks, but Typhlosion being a really good powerhouse as far as fire damage output, he does get type countered. Next thing is we have Charizard. So the best thing about Charizard is he's going to resist a ton of the fighting damage, which is just great. It really does set him up to be really good. The problem is that he gets rocked. Yes, I literally wrote that in my notes. He gets hurt because he has access to these flying type moves. It does help him a ton, but he also carries the flying typing, which makes him end up having a hard time against rock type attackers. So we actually end up winning against Lucario, Blaziken, Magmortar, Typhlosion, and Monferno there. The problem is that we end up losing to Magcargo, Bastiodon, Probopass, Walrein, and Empoleon. So the first three are kind of like a big deal because they have access to rock-type moves like Smackdown, Stone Edge. A lot of those have really big issues. Probopass actually has access, even though he's not in the game, currently his moveset has access to electric-type moves, which is crazy. But he can put a hurting on Charizard as well. Last but not least is Magcargo. So Magcargo is probably my favorite pick out of all 5 of these Pokemon only because of his pure uniqueness. I literally have it written down as fire beats fire. So if you ever wanted to kill it with fire, Magcargo is the way to kill fire with fire. So Magcargo has a very interesting set of tools that really makes him good up against all of the fire types in itself. Plus it has a really good stronghold on its resistances to fire itself. The problem is that it ends up getting really hurt by some of its typing, like being quad weak to water. Yeah, big deal, and you'll kind of see that here. So we actually end up winning with Magcargo against Charizard, Alolan Marowak, Moltres, Ninetales, and Typhlosion. So you can see, all of those are kind of in there. So they kind of have like a really hard time getting over Magcargo's interesting damage output. But we end up losing here to Empoleon, Kingdra, Probopass, Bastiodon, and Lairon. So the problem is that we can just basically get beat down by water damage, and even if they have steel type moves like Lairon, you can end up having a really hard time because you carry that rock typing as well. So what does that tell us about the fire typing? Well, it kind of tells us that depending on what role you really need in your team, you have a lot to work with here. So if you need Pokemon to cover your fire weakness, Magcargo is really good at being a fire type and killing the fire types. Charizard has really good access to flying type moves, which makes him a really good contender up against the fighting types. And he even has access to dragon type moves, which could make him a decent Pokemon up against some of the dragon types. Typhlosion just has an amazing amount of fire damage that he can output. Having access to Shadow Claw and being able to just spam Blast Burn is no joke, and it can really put a hurting if a team already has a kind of weakness to fire. You can basically overwhelm them with tons of fire damage from Typhlosion. Blaziken is crazy. Like, being able to beat the Kings, 2 of the Kings, is a big deal. He does have a weird shielding situation where you do have to really pay attention to your shields, but Blaziken actually having a lot of access to beating the Kings makes him a really big contender in the Cup period. So if you needed coverage more against the Kings, definitely go with Blaziken. Alolan Marowak also kind of falls into the scenario, but it beats the more important King being Lucario. So being a really good counter up against Lucario, Alolan Marowak really secures its place to me as one of the most viable Pokemon. You could kind of switch around Alolan Marowak and Blaziken. Like I said, you can switch around any of these to be the most viable because it really just depends on your team comp and what Pokemon you need to fill the role on your team. So that is actually all that I have for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. What do you guys think of the fire typing? Do you guys think that these are your top 5 most viable Pokemon? That was just my research. I'd love to hear your opinions down in the comments below. Please let me know. But as that being it for today, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments below. And until the next video, I will catch you then.